The weight of sacrifice. The morning sun crept gently through the worn lace curtains of Louise Carter's living room, casting a soft glow across the room. It was a new day, though, for Louise. Every day seemed much like the one before. At 78 years old, her life had settled into a quiet, steady rhythm that revolved around caring for her husband, Carter. Once a proud and strong man, Carter was now a shadow of his former self, confined to a bed in the living room after a devastating injury left him paralyzed. His spine, once sturdy and reliable, had betrayed him in his later years, leaving him dependent on Louise for even the simplest of tasks. Louise moved slowly through the house that had been their home for decades. Her joints ached with every step, but she pushed through the pain, determined to get through another day. Today was grocery day, a task she both dreaded and welcomed. It was a necessary routine, yet each trip filled her with a sense of dread. The list, written in her shaky handwriting, sat on the kitchen table. She glanced over it, her heart sinking when she reached the last item. Adult diapers. It was a necessary purchase, one that reminded her of how much their lives had changed. Louise and Carter had met when they were both young, full of dreams and energy. He was a soldier then, strong and valiant, serving his country with pride. Louise had been drawn to his quiet strength and the way his eyes would soften when he looked at her. They built a life together, raising children, facing life's ups and downs with determination and love. But when Carter's injury occurred, everything changed. Their golden years, which they had once imagined would be spent traveling and enjoying their hard-earned rest, became defined by doctor's appointments, medical bills, and the constant care Carter required. Despite the physical and emotional toll it took on her, Louise had never once considered leaving Carter. Their bond, built over decades of love, was unbreakable. But that didn't make the daily grind any easier. Each day brought new challenges. Lifting Carter in and out of bed, feeding him, administering his medication. And then there was the task of keeping him clean and comfortable, which required her to purchase the adult diapers that weighed so heavily on her heart. Today, as she prepared to leave the house, Carter lay motionless in the bed, his eyes following her every movement. Though he couldn't speak, the love between them was palpable. Louise bent down and kissed his forehead gently, her hand lingering on his cheek. "I'll be back soon," she whispered, her voice soft and reassuring. Carter's eyes flickered with gratitude, but there was also sadness in his gaze. He hated that Louise had to take on this burden. He had always been her protector, her rock, and now he was the one who needed care. The roles had reversed in a way neither of them had ever expected, and the weight of that shift was heavy on both their hearts. Louise picked up her worn purse and the reusable shopping bags that had seen better days. With one last glance at Carter, she made her way to the front door. The outside world, with its bustling streets and vibrant life, felt like a distant reality. Louise's world had shrunk down to the size of their small, cluttered home, and every time she left it, she felt a sense of vulnerability. The stares of strangers, the whispers she imagined, the judgment, these weighed on her more than the groceries she carried. As she stepped out into the bright morning, the air was crisp, a reminder that autumn was fast approaching. The leaves on the trees were beginning to turn, their once vibrant green now tinged with shades of gold and red. Louise had always loved this time of year, but now the beauty of the season was overshadowed by the weight of her responsibilities. Still, she pushed forward, determined to get through another day, to care for Carter as she always had. The grocery store, Simmons's, was a familiar place. It had been around for as long as Louise could remember. The aisles, with their narrow shelves and outdated decor, were a testament to the small town they lived in, a place that hadn't changed much over the years. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed softly, and Louise was greeted by the indifferent gaze of the young cashier behind the counter. He barely glanced at her, his focus on the magazine he was reading. Louise wasn't surprised. She had grown used to the way people looked through her, as though old age had rendered her invisible. She moved slowly through the store, her arthritic knees protesting with each step. Her eyes scanned the shelves, picking up the few items she needed. Bread, milk, eggs, all the staples of their simple life. But as she approached the hygiene aisle, her heart began to race. The adult diapers were there, just as they always were, stacked neatly on the shelf. To anyone else, they were just another product, but to Louise, they represented so much more. They were a symbol of Carter's decline, of the life they had lost. With trembling hands, she reached for a pack, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet aisle. She winced at the sound, feeling as though it was calling attention to her shame. She quickly pulled the package off the shelf, holding it close to her chest, as though she could somehow hide it from view. But the weight of it was nothing compared to the weight she carried in her heart. As she made her way to the checkout, Louise kept her eyes down, avoiding the gazes of the few other shoppers in the store. She knew what they would see. A frail, elderly woman buying diapers, a pitiful sight. The shame burned in her chest, but she kept moving, her focus on getting out of the store as quickly as possible. The line at the checkout was short, but to Louise, it felt like an eternity. She stood there, clutching the diapers, praying that no one would notice her, that no one would say anything. But as she neared the front of the line, her worst fears were realized. A voice behind her, loud and mocking, broke through the quiet. "Diapers, huh? Must be rough getting old." Louise froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't turn around, didn't dare look at the source of the voice. She could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on her, could hear the snickers and whispers. Her hand shook as she placed the diapers on the conveyor belt, her face flushed with humiliation. The cashier, a young man named Isaac, began scanning her items without a word. His face was impassive, but Louise could sense the tension in the air. The voice behind her, the mocking laughter, it was all too much. She wanted to run, to leave the store and never come back. But she couldn't. Carter depended on her. As the laughter continued, Louise stood there, silent and trembling. She had endured so much in her life. Loss, pain, hardship, but this was different. This was a public humiliation, a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. But even in her silence, there was a strength in her, a resilience that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life. And though she didn't know it yet, someone was watching. Someone who would soon change everything. A stranger's compassion. Louise stood frozen at the checkout, her heart pounding in her chest, the words from the mocking voice still echoing in her ears. She stared blankly at the counter, willing herself to disappear, to shrink away from the shame and humiliation. The seconds dragged on, each one a tiny dagger in her soul, piercing through the fragile armor she had built around herself over the years. The young cashier, Isaac, scanned the items in awkward silence, his face expressionless as if trying to ignore the scene unfolding before him. Louise was grateful for that. At least he wasn't joining in on the cruelty. But just as she was about to reach for her wallet, another voice pierced through the air. This one was calm, steady, and filled with quiet authority. "That's enough." The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. The laughter behind her stopped abruptly, as if the person who had been mocking her had been physically silenced. Louise slowly turned her head to see who had spoken. Standing a few feet behind her was a tall man, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and a strong, weathered face that suggested he had seen his share of life's hardships. He wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet kindness in his eyes. The man stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the young man who had mocked her. Louise recognized him now. One of the local boys, always hanging around the town, never seeming to do much of anything. He was grinning nervously, his bravado shrinking in the face of this unexpected challenge. "What's the matter?" the man said, his voice firm but calm. "Never seen someone buy essentials before." The young man shifted uncomfortably, his smirk fading. "I was just messing around," he mumbled, trying to laugh it off. But his eyes darted nervously from the stranger to Louise, and then to the few other customers who had stopped to watch the exchange. "You should know better than to mock someone in need," the man continued, his voice steady but with a sharp edge now. "If this is your idea of fun, I suggest you find something better to do with your time." The young man looked as though he wanted to say something in return, but the weight of the stranger's words held him in check. With a final nervous glance, he muttered something under his breath and slunk out of the store, his bravado completely evaporated. The other shoppers quickly returned to their business, the tension in the air dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. Louise stood in stunned silence, her hands still trembling slightly as she reached for her wallet. The stranger turned to her then, his expression softening as their eyes met. There was no pity in his gaze, just quiet understanding. For a moment, they stood there in silence, a connection forming between two souls who had both seen the harsher side of life. "Are you all right, Mom?" the man asked gently. Louise swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I didn't know what to do." "You don't have to thank me," he replied with a small smile. That was uncalled for, and he needed to be put in his place. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made Louise feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know who this man was, but in that moment, he felt like an anchor, a steady force in a world that had grown increasingly difficult to navigate. Isaac, the cashier, finally finished scanning the last of her items and looked up with an awkward smile. "That'll be $42.50, Mrs. Carter." Louise fumbled with her wallet, her hand still shaking slightly. She hated that she was so rattled, hated that a simple grocery trip had turned into such an ordeal. But before she could pull out the bills, the stranger stepped forward and placed a credit card on the counter. "I've got this," he said simply. Louise's eyes widened in surprise, and she immediately protested. "Oh no, please, you don't need to." "I insist," the man said kindly but firmly. "It's the least I can do." Isaac hesitated for a moment, glancing between them before he swiped the card and handed the receipt to the stranger. Louise stood there, unsure of how to respond. She was touched by the man's kindness, but a part of her also felt embarrassed. She had always prided herself on her independence, even in the face of adversity. Accepting help was something she wasn't used to. The man seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's just groceries," he said with a gentle smile. "We all need a hand sometimes." Louise looked down at the bags in her cart, the weight of her pride warring with the gratitude she felt. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." The man shook his head. "You don't need to. Just take care of yourself and your husband. That's all the thanks I need." Louise's breath caught in her throat. How did he know? She hadn't said anything about Carter, and yet this stranger seemed to know exactly what she was going through. The realization sent a wave of emotion through her, and she had to blink back the tears that were threatening to spill over. "How did you?" she began, her voice trailing off. The man's expression softened, and for the first time, a trace of sadness flickered in his eyes. "I've been there," he said quietly. "My wife. She was sick for a long time. I know what it's like to care for someone you love, day in and day out. It's not easy." Louise's heart clenched at his words. She saw the pain etched in his face, the kind of pain that comes from deep personal loss. For a moment, they were no longer strangers but two people connected by the shared burden of caring for someone they loved. "I'm sorry," Louise whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The man nodded, his expression a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. "It's all right. It was a long time ago, but I haven't forgotten what it feels like. That's why I wanted to help." Louise looked down at her hands, the guilt and gratitude swirling together inside her. She wanted to say more, to express the depth of her gratitude, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded and whispered, "Thank you." The man smiled gently and glanced at the bags in her cart. Do you need help getting these to your car? Louise hesitated for a moment before nodding. That would be kind of you. Together, they walked out of the store, the crisp autumn air hitting them as they stepped into the parking lot. The man carried the heavier bags with ease, and Louise couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. For so long, she had shouldered the weight of everything on her own. Carter's care, the bills, the day-to-day responsibilities. But for this brief moment, someone else was sharing that burden, even if it was just the weight of a few groceries. They reached her old weathered car, and the man carefully placed the bags in the trunk. He closed it gently, then turned to face her. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask," he said, his tone sincere. "You're not alone in this." Louise looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough." The man smiled softly. "Just keep going. That's thanks enough." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the small town streets. Louise stood there for a long moment, watching him go, her heart heavy, but also lighter than it had been in a long time. As she got into her car and drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time in years, she had encountered something rare: kindness without expectation, compassion without pity. And though the weight of her responsibilities remained, she knew that, somehow, she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. A flicker of hope. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road doing little to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in Louise's mind. The stranger's face kept appearing in her thoughts, his words playing over and over again. "You're not alone." Simple words, but they had penetrated something deep within her, something she had long buried under years of exhaustion, frustration, and the ceaseless grind of caregiving. The autumn trees outside blurred into a kaleidoscope of reds, oranges, and yellows as she passed them. The beauty of the season was lost on her, as it had been for the past few years. She barely noticed the crispness of the air or the way the sun bathed everything in a warm golden hue. Her life had become so consumed by Carter's illness, by the constant trips to doctors, the endless bills, and the gradual decline of the man she had once known so well, that the world around her had faded into the background. It was like living in a fog, everything muted, dulled, distant. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, a small flicker of something stirred within her. It wasn't a full-fledged hope, not yet. It was something more fragile, like the first spark of a match, delicate and easily extinguished. She had no illusions that things would magically get better, that Carter would wake up one day cured, that the financial strain would disappear, or that the relentless weight of caregiving would suddenly lift. No, she wasn't foolish enough to believe in miracles anymore. But what the stranger had given her was something else. The quiet, almost forgotten reassurance that perhaps she didn't have to shoulder it all alone. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world willing to help without expecting anything in return. The thought was unsettling. For so long, Louise had relied on herself. It wasn't pride, exactly, but necessity. When Carter first got sick, people had offered their support. Neighbors, friends, even distant relatives. But as the months turned into years, their lives moved on. The visits grew less frequent. The offers of help dwindled. It wasn't anyone's fault. Really, life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and Carter's illness wasn't something that could be fixed with a few casseroles and kind words. It was a marathon, not a sprint, and people, no matter how well-meaning, didn't have the stamina for that kind of endurance race. But she had to. She had no choice. As her small house came into view, tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, Louise sighed heavily. It was an old place, weathered by time and neglect. The once bright paint had long since faded, peeling away in places where the elements had taken their toll. The garden, once her pride and joy, was now overgrown, weeds creeping up where roses and daffodils used to bloom. Everything about the house felt like a reflection of her own life, once full of color and promise, now dulled and overrun by the relentless march of time and hardship. She pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, sitting for a moment in the stillness of the car. The bags of groceries in the trunk suddenly felt like they weighed a ton, a physical manifestation of the burdens she carried. She rested her head against the steering wheel, allowing herself a brief moment of stillness, of vulnerability. The tears she had been holding back since the grocery store finally spilled over, silently rolling down her cheeks. It wasn't just the cruelty of the young man's words that had undone her. It was the accumulation of everything. The years of struggle, the isolation, the constant pressure to keep it all together. And now, this unexpected kindness from a stranger. It was too much, all of it. She had been holding on so tightly for so long, afraid that if she let go even a little, everything would come crashing down around her. But now, in the quiet of her driveway, she allowed herself to break, just for a moment. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. There was no time for a breakdown. Carter would be waiting for her inside, and she couldn't afford to wallow in her own emotions. Not when there were meals to prepare, medications to administer, and 100 other little tasks that needed her attention. As she unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of antiseptic and the faint hum of the oxygen machine greeted her. Carter was in the living room, as usual, propped up in his recliner with a blanket draped over his frail body. His once vibrant brown hair had thinned considerably, and his skin, once tanned and healthy, was now pale and sallow. But his eyes, those were the same. Clear, sharp, and full of love. Even though his body had betrayed him, Carter's mind was still there, still present. It was both a blessing and a curse. "Hey, Han," Louise said softly as she set the groceries on the kitchen counter. "I'm back." Carter smiled weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How was the store?" "Same as always," she replied, not wanting to burden him with the incident. There was no point in adding to his worries. He had enough to deal with. "I got everything we needed." She busied herself with putting the groceries away, her movements mechanical and efficient. But as she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about the stranger. Who was he? And why had he helped her? People didn't just do that anymore, not without expecting something in return. And yet, he had walked away without so much as a second glance, leaving her with more than just a paid grocery bill. He had left her with a sense of possibility. That maybe not everyone had forgotten her. That maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world who cared. As she finished putting away the last of the groceries, Carter called out from the living room, his voice raspier than usual. "Lou, come sit with me for a bit." Louise wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked over to the recliner, sinking down into the worn armchair beside him. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over the years. Carter studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing in concern. "You all right? You look tired." Louise forced a smile, trying to push away the weariness that seemed to cling to her like a shadow. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just a long day." He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently. "You've been doing too much. You should take a break." Louise's smile faltered. A break. The idea seemed almost laughable. When was there time for a break? Between caring for Carter, managing the household, and trying to make ends meet, there was no room for rest. But as she sat there, her hand in his, she realized that something had shifted within her. Maybe it was the stranger's words, or maybe it was the simple act of someone stepping in to help, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she didn't have to do it all alone. "I'll take a break soon," she promised, though the words felt hollow. She had made similar promises before, but they never seemed to materialize. There was always something that needed her attention, always some new crisis to manage. But Carter, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the weight she was carrying. He squeezed her hand again, his eyes soft with concern. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Lou," he said quietly. "It's okay to ask for help." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For years, she had been the strong one, the one holding everything together. But now, sitting here beside the man she loved, she realized that maybe he was right. Maybe it was okay to ask for help. Maybe it was okay to lean on someone else, even if just for a little while. As she sat there in the quiet of the living room, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the gentle rise and fall of Carter's breath, Louise made a decision. She would find a way to ask for help. She didn't know how yet, or who she would turn to, but she knew she couldn't keep going like this, not without something breaking. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a small flicker of hope, fragile but real. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The weight of vulnerability. The days that followed brought no immediate relief, but there was something different in Louise's routine. The idea that she might ask for help had planted itself firmly in her mind, though it felt foreign and uncomfortable. It gnawed at her as she went through the motions, administering Carter's medications, cooking meals, handling the never-ending phone calls with insurance companies, and trying to keep the house in some semblance of order. She found herself thinking about the stranger more often than she expected, wondering who he was and what had compelled him to help her that day. The city was full of people, most too busy with their own lives to notice someone like her, someone who had slipped into the margins. But he had noticed, and that simple act had shaken her in ways she still couldn't fully comprehend. The week dragged on, the familiar exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket, but this time it was punctuated by moments of contemplation. Each time she caught herself slipping into the mechanical autopilot of her daily life, that voice echoed in her mind. "You don't have to be strong all the time." Carter's words had stayed with her too. She wasn't used to thinking of herself as vulnerable. After all, she had been forced to become resilient out of necessity. There was no room for weakness when your entire life revolved around caring for someone else. But maybe Carter had a point. The mere thought of asking for help felt like admitting defeat, and yet, wasn't she already losing the battle? Not with Carter, but with herself. Her health, both mental and physical, had been deteriorating for years. She couldn't remember the last time she had a proper night's sleep. The lines on her face, the ache in her bones, the constant hum of anxiety, they were all signs she had ignored for too long. How much longer could she go on like this before something gave way? One afternoon, as she sat in the small kitchen after preparing Carter's lunch, she decided to make a list. It was an impulsive decision, but she felt the urge to organize her thoughts. She grabbed a notebook from the counter, one usually reserved for keeping track of Carter's medications, and began to write. The first line was simple. "What do I need help with?" She stared at the page for a long time, the pen hovering over the paper. The answer should have been obvious: everything. But breaking it down into concrete tasks felt impossible. Her mind was so used to seeing the whole overwhelming picture, where each responsibility bowled into the next, that she struggled to isolate specific areas where help might make a difference. Finally, she wrote groceries. It was a start. She had seen neighbors using online delivery services or asking friends to pick up essentials for them, but she had always resisted. Not because it wasn't convenient, but because it felt like one more step toward admitting she couldn't handle things herself. She added a few more items to the list: house cleaning, yard work, medical appointments. Each task seemed small on its own, but together they formed the backbone of her daily existence, an endless cycle of things that needed doing. She had taken it all on without complaint for so long, telling herself she could handle it because she had to. But now, looking at the list in front of her, it didn't seem so unreasonable to want help. It didn't make her weak. It made her human. Still, knowing she needed help and asking for it were two different things. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Sarah, an old friend from work. They hadn't spoken in months, not since the last awkward phone call where Sarah had offered to stop by sometime, a vague promise that neither of them expected to follow through on. Louise's first instinct was to ignore it. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, but something made her pick up the phone this time. "Hey, Sarah," Louise said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Louise, it's so good to hear from you. I was just thinking about you the other day. How are you and Carter doing?" Sarah's voice was warm, but Louise could hear the undertone of concern. "We're managing," Louise replied, her usual response. It was easier than explaining the real situation. "Listen, I know I haven't been around much lately," Sarah continued, "but I was wondering if you'd like some company one of these days. Maybe we could have coffee or something. I miss catching up with you." Louise hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. It would be so easy to say no, to push Sarah away like she had with so many others. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the fact that Sarah had reached out, or maybe it was the weight of the list she had just written. Whatever it was, she found herself saying, "Actually, that would be nice." Sarah sounded pleasantly surprised. "Really? That's great. How about tomorrow morning? I could swing by with some coffee, and we can just sit and chat." "Tomorrow sounds good," Louise replied, feeling a mixture of anxiety and relief. She hadn't allowed anyone into her home in so long, not really. The thought of having someone else in her space, even for something as simple as coffee, was both daunting and oddly comforting. After hanging up, Louise stared at the list again. The next step, she realized, would be harder than she thought. She had agreed to let Sarah in, but she hadn't asked for help yet. Tomorrow would be her chance, and the thought filled her with a nervous energy. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the kitchen windows, Louise found herself cleaning furiously. She scrubbed the countertops, wiped down the dining table, and tidied up the living room. She wasn't entirely sure why. Sarah wouldn't care if there was a little dust, or if the house wasn't immaculate. But it felt like something she had to do. Maybe it was a way of asserting control over the situation, of making sure that despite everything, she still had a handle on things. Carter watched from his recliner, his tired eyes following her movements. "You don't have to do all that," he murmured. "It's just Sarah." "I know," Louise replied, forcing a smile. "I just want things to be nice." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't just about Sarah. It was about what this visit represented. An opening, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. And once that crack was there was no telling what might come through. By the time Sarah arrived, Louise's nerves were frayed. But when she opened the door and saw her friend standing there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, she felt a wave of warmth wash over her. Sarah's smile was genuine, her eyes full of kindness. "I brought your favorite," Sarah said, handing Louise a cup. "Still a caramel latte fan, right?" Louise nodded, taking the cup gratefully. "You remembered." "Of course I did," Sarah replied with a grin. "Come on, let's sit." They settled into the living room, Sarah in the chair across from Carter, and Louise beside him on the couch. For the first few minutes, they made small talk. Sarah asked about Carter's health, and Louise gave her the usual updates. But after a while, the conversation shifted, becoming more comfortable, more familiar. They laughed about old times at work, shared stories of mutual acquaintances, and for a brief moment, Louise allowed herself to forget about the weight she carried. But the list was still in the back of her mind, nagging at her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Louise took a deep breath and spoke. "Sarah, I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant. "I could really use some help around here." Sarah's expression softened, and she set her cup down. "Of course. What do you need?" Louise blinked, taken aback by the ease of her friend's response. She had expected more resistance, or at least some questions, but Sarah had answered without hesitation, as though offering help was the most natural thing in the world. I don't know where to start," Louise admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. "There's just so much." Sarah reached out, placing her hand on Louise's arm. "You don't have to do this alone. Just tell me what you need, and we'll figure it out." For the first time in years, Louise felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't sure where this would lead or how much help she would actually accept, but for now, she had taken the first step. And that, she realized, was enough. The unraveling of control. Louise hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to let go. Though she had agreed to Sarah's help and had even written her list, it was as if each step toward relinquishing control came with a cost. The day after Sarah's visit, Louise stood in the doorway, watching her friend scrub the kitchen floor, and felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also an acute sense of failure. This was her job. This was her responsibility. To watch someone else do it, even someone offering out of kindness, stirred up feelings she wasn't ready to face. Louise had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, especially after Carter's diagnosis. There was no handbook for being a full-time caregiver, and she had learned everything by necessity, becoming both nurse and housekeeper in a life that no longer resembled the one she'd imagined. So much of her identity was wrapped up in doing everything herself, in being the unwavering support for Carter. Asking for help felt like unraveling a thread in a tightly woven fabric. One tug, and the whole thing might fall apart. Sarah, perhaps sensing Louise's discomfort, tried to ease the tension. "You know," she said, pausing in her scrubbing, "I'm not doing this because I think you're incapable. I'm doing this because I want to help, and it's okay to let people in sometimes." Louise offered a weak smile. "I know. It's just hard." "Believe me, I get it," Sarah replied, sitting back on her heels and wiping her brow. "But you don't have to prove anything. You've been carrying this weight for so long, longer than most people could handle. It's okay to let someone else share the load." Louise nodded but remained silent. Inside, a storm of conflicting thoughts swirled. She knew Sarah was right, but knowing it didn't make it easier. Each time she watched someone else take over a task, even something as mundane as grocery shopping or cleaning, it felt like a small piece of her independence was being chipped away. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The house started to feel less suffocating, and with Sarah's help, some of the relentless pressure began to lift. It wasn't that the tasks had magically disappeared. They were still there, of course, but now they were shared. And in that sharing, Louise found herself with small pockets of time she hadn't had in years. Time to sit with a cup of tea in the morning without immediately launching into the day's chores. Time to watch a movie with Carter, even if they both fell asleep halfway through. Time to just breathe. Sarah had also taken over scheduling some of Carter's appointments, a task that had always filled Louise with dread. Dealing with doctors, navigating insurance, and coordinating transportation had become a second job for her. Now, with Sarah handling it, Louise could focus more on Carter himself, instead of being consumed by logistics. One morning, after Sarah had dropped off groceries, Louise found herself staring at the window, watching the world outside. It was a crisp fall day. The trees lining the street, a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. For the first time in what felt like forever, she noticed the beauty of the season. The leaves that fluttered down to the pavement, the soft breeze carrying the scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. She hadn't allowed herself to enjoy these small things in so long, her mind always preoccupied with the next task, the next responsibility. But today, standing in the kitchen, she felt something stir deep inside her, something that had been dormant for years. It was a memory, or perhaps just the ghost of a feeling she once knew, the sense of being alive, not merely existing. She had spent so long in survival mode that she had forgotten what it was like to simply be. She turned away from the window and walked into the living room, where Carter was napping in his recliner. His face was peaceful, his breathing slow and steady, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared, for the life they had built, even if it wasn't the life they had expected. Gratitude for Sarah, for showing her that help wasn't a weakness, but a gift. But with that gratitude came something else, a deeper, more unsettling emotion. Vulnerability. Louise had always been terrified of being vulnerable, of admitting that she couldn't handle everything on her own. But now that she had begun to accept help, she realized just how fragile her sense of control had been. It wasn't real control at all. It was a desperate attempt to keep the chaos at bay. And now, standing on the edge of that realization, she felt exposed. Later that afternoon, Sarah stopped by again, this time with fresh bread from the local bakery. They sat at the small kitchen table, the bread between them, steam rising from the sliced loaf. "Do you ever wonder how you ended up here?" Louise asked suddenly, surprising even herself with the question. She hadn't meant to voice it aloud, but once it was out, she couldn't take it back. Sarah looked at her, then down at her cup of tea. "All the time," she said softly. "But I try not to dwell on it. Life's strange like that. You make all these plans, and then something completely unexpected comes along and changes everything. The trick, I think, is learning how to adapt. That's what you've been doing, whether you realize it or not." Louise stared at her tea, swirling it absent-mindedly with a spoon. "I just feel like I'd lost myself somewhere along the way." "You haven't lost yourself," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You've been buried under a mountain of responsibility, but you're still there. And you're starting to dig your way out." Louise wanted to believe that, but it was hard. She had spent so long suppressing her own needs, her own desires, that she wasn't sure she knew who she was anymore. Caring for Carter had consumed her, to the point where her identity had been swallowed by the role of caregiver. She had forgotten what it was like to be Louise, not just Carter's wife, not just the one who held everything together, but herself. That night, after Sarah left, Louise lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She thought about the years she had spent in this house, watching over Carter, making sure everything was in order. She thought about the list she had written, the tasks she had handed over to Sarah. And then, she thought about the things she hadn't put on the list, the emotional weight, the constant fear, the loneliness that had settled into her bones like a cold that wouldn't go away. She had been so focused on the physical aspects of caregiving that she had neglected the emotional toll it had taken on her. There were no checkboxes for the nights spent crying in the bathroom, or the panic attacks that gripped her when she thought about what might happen if Carter's condition worsened. There was no task to hand over when the weight of it all became too much to bear. But maybe, she realized, those were the things she needed help with the most. The next day, she called Sarah again, but this time, the conversation was different. "I need to talk to someone," Louise said, her voice barely a whisper. "A professional. I think I'm not okay." Sarah's response was immediate and filled with understanding. "I'm so glad you told me. I know a therapist who specializes in caregivers. I can get you the number if you want." Louise felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was terrifying to admit that she wasn't coping as well as she pretended, but there was also a sense of liberation in finally saying it out loud. For years, Louise had been running on empty, trying to be everything for everyone. But now, with the smallest glimmer of hope, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to ask for help, not just with the house or with Carter, but with herself. The days ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when she questioned her decision to let go. But for the first time in a long while, Louise felt like she wasn't alone in carrying the burden. And that made all the difference. Reclaiming pieces of herself. Louise's first therapy session was scheduled for a chilly Thursday afternoon, and the lead-up was filled with a peculiar mix of dread and anticipation. She wasn't sure what to expect, nor did she fully know how much of herself she was ready to lay bare. Years of keeping her emotions tightly guarded had turned her heart into a fortress, its walls high and impenetrable. The thought of dismantling even a small part of that terrified her. As she sat in the waiting room, the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. Each second that passed felt like a countdown to something significant, an unveiling of the things she had long hidden. When the door finally opened and the therapist, a woman named Dr. Emery, invited her in, Louise hesitated only briefly before stepping into the quiet, softly lit room. Dr. Emery was warm and kind, with an easy smile that put Louise at some ease. They spent the first few minutes exchanging pleasantries, discussing the weather, and briefly touching on Louise's life as a caregiver. But it wasn't long before the conversation turned to deeper matters, those same emotional weights Louise had kept buried for so long. "So tell me about what brings you here," Dr. Emery began, her tone gentle yet probing. "What's been the hardest part of caring for your husband?" Louise took a deep breath. She wasn't sure where to start. The hardest part. How could she possibly distill years of exhaustion, fear, and isolation into a single sentence? I guess it's the feeling of being trapped," Louise said slowly, her eyes fixed on the patterned rug beneath her feet. "I love Carter, and I want to take care of him. But sometimes it feels like I've lost myself in all of this. I've become his caregiver, and that's all I am now. I don't know who I am anymore outside of that." Dr. Emery nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very common feeling for caregivers. It's easy to get so consumed by the needs of the person you're caring for that your own needs get pushed aside. But it sounds like you're starting to recognize that, and that's an important first step." Louise shifted in her chair, feeling the weight of those words settle over her. It was true. For so long, she had placed Carter's needs above her own, and now she was paying the price. But acknowledging the truth also felt like a betrayal, as though she was admitting that she resented the role she had taken on. She didn't resent Carter, of course. He was her husband, and she loved him deeply. But the role, the constant, never-ending responsibility, yes, that was a different story. "I feel guilty," Louise admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel guilty for wanting time for myself, for feeling frustrated or tired. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him because I can't do it all." Dr. Emery leaned forward slightly, her expression sympathetic. "It's not uncommon to feel that way. But I want you to understand something. Needing help or wanting time for yourself doesn't make you a bad caregiver. It makes you human. Caregiving is an incredibly difficult, emotionally taxing role, and you're allowed to have your own feelings and needs. You're allowed to be more than just Carter's caregiver." The words struck Louise in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had been so entrenched in the belief that being a good caregiver meant sacrificing everything else, her time, her desires, even her identity. But Dr. Emery's words held a different truth, one she hadn't considered. Maybe being a good caregiver didn't mean losing herself entirely. Maybe it was possible to care for Carter and still have space for her own needs. The session continued, with Dr. Emery guiding Louise through the tangled web of emotions she had been carrying for so long. They talked about the overwhelming sense of responsibility, the isolation of being a caregiver, and the ways in which Louise had slowly disappeared beneath the weight of it all. But they also talked about solutions, small steps Louise could take to reclaim parts of herself, to begin the process of rediscovering who she was beyond the role she had taken on. One suggestion was to carve out time each day, even if it was just 15 minutes, for something that was entirely for Louise. Whether it was reading a book, taking a walk, or simply sitting in silence with a cup of tea, the idea was to create a space where she could reconnect with herself. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but as Louise thought about it more, she realized how long it had been since she had done anything just for herself. The days following that first therapy session were strange in their own way. There was a sense of newness in her routine, a subtle shift in how she approached the tasks that had once overwhelmed her. Sarah continued to help around the house, and Louise noticed how much more she was able to enjoy the little moments she spent with Carter now that the burden wasn't solely on her shoulders. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments of frustration, exhaustion, and even guilt. But something was different. Louise was different. She had taken Dr. Emery's advice to heart and started carving out time for herself. At first, it felt indulgent, even wrong, to sit down with a book or step outside for a walk while the laundry piled up or dinner needed to be made. But with each passing day, it became a little easier. She found solace in those brief moments of solitude, a quiet sanctuary where she could breathe without the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. One afternoon, after Sarah had dropped by to help with Carter's physical therapy, Louise found herself standing in the doorway of her home office, a room she hadn't stepped foot in for years. The door had remained closed for so long that she had almost forgotten what was inside. Her old desk, her computer, and shelves, lined with books she used to love. Tentatively, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the window, and the room smelled faintly of old paper and neglect. Louise ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, her mind flooding with memories of a time when she had dreams and ambitions outside of her caregiving role. There had been a time, long before Carter's illness, when she had wanted to be a writer, when she had spent hours crafting short stories and essays, losing herself in the world of words. Those dreams had been pushed aside, of course, once Carter's condition worsened. But now, standing in the room that had once been her creative sanctuary, Louise felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rediscover that part of herself. Maybe she could still write, still find joy in something that was entirely her own. Over the next few weeks, Louise began spending more time in the office. She dusted off her old desk, opened her computer, and started writing again. At first, it was slow, hesitant, like a muscle that had gone unused for too long. But as the words began to flow, something inside her shifted. She was reconnecting with a part of herself that had been buried for too long, and with each word she typed, she felt a little more whole. Her writing wasn't perfect, and she wasn't working on anything grand or ambitious. Sometimes it was just journaling, putting her thoughts and feelings down on paper as a way of processing everything she had been through. Other times, she wrote short stories, letting her imagination take her to places far removed from the reality of her life. It was an escape, yes, but it was also a way of reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost. As Louise embraced these moments of self-discovery, she noticed a change not only in herself, but also in her relationship with Carter. The resentment that had once simmered beneath the surface began to fade, replaced by a deeper sense of love and connection. She was able to be more present with him, to truly enjoy the moments they spent together, because she wasn't running on empty anymore. And in those quiet moments, as they sat together watching the sunset or listening to music, Louise realized that she hadn't lost herself after all. She had simply been waiting for the right time to emerge from the shadows and step into the light once again. A new dawn of possibility. The cold, brittle air of winter had slowly begun to give way to the soft, tentative touch of spring. Louise watched as the first buds of greenery pushed their way through the frost-bitten earth in her garden, a sight that mirrored her own transformation in the months following her first therapy session. Life, it seemed, had a way of persisting even in the most inhospitable conditions, and Louise felt a quiet kinship with those fragile plants. She, too, was learning how to grow again. Her days were no less busy than before. Caring for Carter was still a full-time job, and though he had plateaued in some areas, there were always new challenges. Yet, something had shifted within Louise. The exhaustion that had once defined her every waking moment now felt more manageable, not because her workload had decreased, but because she had allowed herself to share the burden. Her weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Emery had become an anchor, a safe space where she could explore the deep well of emotions that came with being a caregiver, emotions she had kept buried for far too long. Louise had begun to let Sarah, her daughter, help in more ways. At first, it had felt like an admission of weakness to rely on Sarah, but over time she saw it for what it truly was, an act of love. Sarah, for her part, had embraced the opportunity. It gave them both something they had been craving, a chance to reconnect, to bridge the emotional distance that had grown between them since Carter's illness took over their lives. Sarah would often spend afternoons with Carter, telling him stories about her day or showing him photos of places she had been. Carter would smile, even if his understanding of those moments was fragmented. But there was a warmth, a joy in the room that hadn't been there before. Louise, too, had found new ways to spend her time. Her writing had flourished in those quiet hours she set aside for herself, though it was less about the act of creation and more about what it represented, a reclaiming of her identity. The stories she wrote varied. Sometimes they were light-hearted tales of adventure. Other times they were reflections on her own life, filtered through fictional characters. But each word, each page, felt like a small triumph. Writing had once been a dream she let go of, but now it was a lifeline. As spring began to warm the world outside, Louise found herself not just surviving but living. She had discovered a delicate balance between the roles of caregiver, mother, and woman, and while the scales tipped at times, she no longer felt as though she was drowning beneath the weight of them. She had learned to let others help her, to accept that she didn't have to carry everything alone. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned to give herself permission to have needs, to want things, and to pursue her own happiness, even in the midst of her responsibilities. One afternoon, as she sat in her small office, the sunlight streaming through the window, Louise found herself reflecting on how much had changed. She hadn't written much that day, instead spending the time journaling about her journey thus far. The entries from months ago were filled with exhaustion, despair, and guilt, but now, as she read her most recent words, there was a tone of resilience, of hope. Her thoughts drifted to Carter. He had once been a man of strength, someone she relied on for so much. His sharp wit, his protective nature, and his unshakable optimism had defined their early years together. But the illness had changed everything, leaving her to shoulder the responsibilities that had once been shared. It had been hard, watching him slip away, piece by piece. Yet even now, there were moments when she saw flickers of the man he had been. A soft smile, a knowing glance, a rare moment of clarity where he would reach out to touch her hand and hold it, as if to remind her that he was still there. In those moments, Louise realized that caregiving, though demanding, had also deepened her connection with Carter in ways she hadn't anticipated. The love they shared wasn't based on words anymore, or even memories. It was something far more profound, an unspoken bond forged through years of shared experiences, through the quiet moments of tenderness, and through the simple act of presence. She had learned to communicate with him without speaking, to find joy in his company even when the conversations were one-sided. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the warm glow of twilight, Louise sat beside Carter's bed. He had been more lucid that day, his gaze following her as she moved about the room. She had played his favorite music, an old jazz record that they used to dance to in their younger years, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were back in that time, when life had been simple and their worries had been few. "Do you remember this song?" Louise asked, her voice soft, though she wasn't sure if he could still grasp the meaning of her words. Carter's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. He didn't respond, but there was something in his expression that made her heart swell. She took his hand, feeling the roughness of his skin, and squeezed it gently. They sat like that for a while, listening to the music, letting the world outside fade away. It was in these moments that Louise found the strength to keep going. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about the small, quiet moments of connection that made everything worth it. Carter had been her partner for so many years, and though their roles had shifted, that partnership was still there. They were still a team, even if the dynamic had changed. As the weeks turned into months, Louise continued to carve out time for herself, to write, to think, and to be. Her world, once so narrow and suffocating, had expanded in ways she hadn't thought possible. She began to reach out to other caregivers, joining an online support group where she could share her experiences and hear from others who understood the unique challenges of her life. These connections gave her strength, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this journey. Louise had also started to think about the future, something that had once seemed impossible. She knew that Carter's condition wouldn't improve, that the road ahead would be filled with more difficult days. But she no longer feared it. She had faced the hardest parts of herself, the guilt, the exhaustion, the grief, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient. And in doing so, she had found a way to balance her love for Carter with the love she had rediscovered for herself. One morning, as Louise sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, she realized that she had been writing her own story all along. Not just on the pages of her journal or in the short stories she had crafted, but in the way she had chosen to live, to navigate the complexities of her life with grace and determination. She had learned that caregiving didn't have to mean losing herself. It could be a path to discovering new facets of who she was. Looking out the window at the garden, now in full bloom, Louise felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world had changed, and so had she. But through it all, she had found a way to not just survive, but to thrive, reclaiming the parts of herself she had thought were lost forever. In the end, Louise understood that her journey wasn't about being the perfect caregiver, wife, or mother. It was about being human, embracing the messiness, the imperfections, and the beauty of life in all its forms. She had found balance, not by doing everything, but by learning to let go, to accept help, and to honor her own needs. And in that balance, she had found herself again. For the first time in years, Louise felt ready for whatever the future held. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and the possibilities were endless.